Here we go. Actor Jussie Smollett said he was the victim of a savage, racist, homophobic attack. Now his story seems to be, let us say, unraveling, and the entire attack may turn out to be a stunt arranged by the actor himself. We'll have all of that soon, right from Chicago, plus an appearance on this show by Tucker himself. Don't ask me how we pulled that off. But first, President Trump has pulled the trigger, declaring a national state of emergency on the southern border in order to fund and build a wall and other things. How did it happen, and how will the emergency work? Washington correspondent Kristen Fisher is all around the madness, and she's here to unwind it all for us. Kristen.
Hey, Brian. Well, this emergency declaration is only a few hours old, but already the ACLU says that it will sue President Trump, and the House Judiciary Committee has launched an investigation. Democrats on the committee sent a letter to President Trump tonight saying that we believe your declaration of an emergency shows a reckless disregard for the separation of powers and your own responsibilities under our constitutional system. By fabricating an emergency order to bypass the political process for allocating a budget, you appear to be abusing both this trust and your own oath of office. But President Trump predicted all of that when he announced the emergency declaration in the Rose Garden earlier today.
The order is signed, and I'll sign the final papers, and we will then be sued, and they will sue us in the Ninth Circuit, even though it shouldn't be there, and we will possibly get a bad ruling, and then we'll get another bad ruling, and then we'll end up in the Supreme Court, and hopefully we'll get a fair shake, and we'll win in the Supreme Court.
Now, the declaration will give President Trump about $8 billion to build his border wall. The White House says its attorneys have spent weeks going through the ins and outs of an emergency declaration to ensure that President Trump is on solid ground, and they believe he is. But some Republicans believe it's an abuse of executive power and could set a bad precedent. So this is going to be hashed out in court and in Congress for quite some time. But at least Washington has avoided another government shutdown, Brian. That was set to start in just about 4 hours if they hadn't reached a deal.
Right.
Brian?
And I just love the way the president went through that, because he basically outlined what we're going to be covering and how we're going to be covering it over the next year or so. Kristen, thanks so much.
He did. Thanks.
All right. Meanwhile, the president vowed that his national emergency will get the job done and halt the decades-long crisis at the border.
We're going to be signing today and registering national emergency because we have an invasion of drugs, invasion of gangs, invasion of people, and it's unacceptable. So we have a chance of getting close to $8 billion. Whether it's $8 billion or $2 billion or $1.5 billion, it's going to build a lot of wall. We're getting it done.
Well, he got a green light for at least 55 miles of wall, and then we'll see about the $8 billion. He'll get you a lot more. But CNN's Jim Acosta accused the president of conjuring up a broken border crisis out of thin air.
Let me just ask you this. What do you say to your critics who say that you are creating a national emergency, that you're concocting a national emergency here in order to get your wall?
I asked the angel moms, what do you think? Do you think I'm creating something? Ask these incredible women who lost their daughters and their sons. Okay.
They were there with pictures of their loved ones. What an answer, what a comeback. Why does the president keep calling on him? Well, that's the consensus. The media and of the left, despite millions of illegal immigrants, despite the mess of the border, they think the president made it up. And our border is just fine.
The president of the United States is going to declare a national emergency on our southern border. But I have to tell you, it doesn't look like an emergency from where I'm standing.
It's not an emergency, what's happening at the border.
A national emergency to solve his manufactured crisis.
We don't have a national emergency. That's just not true. There is no national emergency.
There is no national emergency.
Right. There's just simply no emergency there.
What are we, stupid? A manufactured emergency.
Really? Well, the Migration Policy Institute estimates that 827,000 of the 11 million here illegally are convicted criminals. That's a total of 7%. Not 1% should be in the country. Mark Morgan is a former head of the Border Patrol, and he's heard the rhetoric, but he knows the reality. Mark, is the president making up an emergency?
Absolutely not. And Brian, this is the part of the frustration for those of us from a law enforcement, border security perspective. How many more statistics do we have to provide? How many more factually based examples do we have to provide? How many more angel families have to stand in front of some of these individuals before they finally say, yeah, okay, this is real. It's just incredulous.
It's true. And the other thing I thought about too, Mark, and because I know you served during the Obama years, there was an emergency then. They chose not to act on it. It doesn't mean there's not one now, and it doesn't mean they're not getting worse. I mean, the numbers this year show a huge uptick in apprehensions. That doesn't count the people we don't catch. So when people say to you, the drugs are coming through the port of entry, let's use some technology to crack down there, there's no problem with drugs in the middle of the country and other areas not populated. What do you say?
Well, that's right. And a couple of things you hit on, Brian, and you're spot on. So first of all, look at the take right now. 60,000 are coming in a month illegally into this country. So this year so far, 62 caravans of 100 or more, 13 of all of last year, 2,000 in one single day this week. So the numbers are climbing, but it's manufactured, right? And the other thing, the other argument on in between the ports of entry, it's a absolute false narrative. 60% of the southwest border does not have enough infrastructure, technology, and personnel. I call that wide open. So they're disingenuous when they talk about the ports, because we don't, Brian, just what you said, we don't know what's getting through, but we do know that it is getting through, and there's a lot that we're not interdicting in between the ports.
So, you know, it's just amazing, too, because not only did most Democrats not agree, there's a new trend. And mark my words, it's going to be happening all week. Instead of build the wall, take down the fence. That's going to be the method. As a person who's out there trying to defend our border, what does that mean to you?
Again, what it means to me is that this is absolutely driven on identity politics. The experts have spoken both on ICE, both on the United States Border Patrol and CBP, and they've told Congress what they need to protect our borders, for the security and safety of this country, Brian. And they have not just ignored it. They have just absolutely discounted everything that they've said. And unfortunately, to me, I've only drawn one conclusion. It's based on identity politics.
And I just asked for the latest, that's why I was looking down, the latest news about January. And so far in January, apprehensions have risen up. There were 58,207 apprehensions in January. That's the highest it's been over the past 5 years. And those are the people, as you always tell us, that you get. What about the ones we don't know about? And I just talked to somebody else who just went down to the border because they're serving in the military. And they say some of the techniques that these people crossing are using mirror the military techniques that they've seen in battle. That's what's happening in Arizona. So share more of those stories. Mark, thanks for your up close and personal, unbiased look at what's happening at the border. We'll see where we go from here. Thanks, meanwhile, Brian. 8 minutes after the top of the hour, while President Trump seeks to build a wall, some Democrats think walls are so evil, as I said before, they want to start an anti-wall jihad. Potential presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke said he wants to eliminate whatever defenses are on the Mexican border, in this case, Texas.
If you could, would you take the wall down now, here?
Yes.
Like you have a wall.
Absolutely.
Knock it down.
I'd take the wall down.
And do you think the city, if there's a referendum here in this city, that would pass?
I do.
Right. And then ask that question and then run back to New York. Kristen Gillibrand always looking for a new cause to jump on the bandwagon. She might think her ratings might tick up a little bit. She chimed in, and guess what she said?
The idea of dismantling some of the wall, good idea, bad idea?
Well, I'd have to ask folks in that part of the country to see whether the fencing that exists today is helpful or unhelpful. So I could look at it and see which part he means and why, and if it makes sense, I could support it.
If you've been in Washington this long and haven't asked anybody who works the border if a fence helps or not, you're not doing your job. Chris Hahn is a radio host, former staffer to Senator Chuck Schumer, joins us now. First off, Chris, your reaction to the president's using emergency powers?
Completely unconstitutional. I expect all these Federalist Society guys for the last 100 years talking about strict construction of the United States Constitution. Article 1, Section 5, 6, and 7 tells who gets to decide where money is spent. Whether you think the wall is necessary or not, the president needs to convince Congress to do this. And if Congress does not stand up to the president, I don't know why they are there. Are they there for the state-run offices and the fancy pins? Their job is for their ambition to counteract the president's ambition, and it is their job as members of Congress to determine where money is spent. And if you are in Congress and worried about being primaried on this issue, maybe you should step down from your leadership position and let somebody with courage to actually do the job of a member of Congress take the reins of that spot and do the job appropriately. This is completely unconstitutional.
Let me give you a scenario.
Down 9-0
I
by the
empower
Supreme
Chris Hahn.
Court.
I empower Chris Hahn. as President of the United States or somebody in that area, governor of Texas, Arizona, and you see a legitimate problem at the border and no one else than politics is keeping you from backing up the border and keeping the people safe that you were elected to do, you would do anything you could to protect your family, your constituents. That's exactly what the president's doing. And thanks to a 1976 ruling, he's got the executive power to do it. And he says, if you have a problem with it, take me to court. What's wrong with that?
Well, look, you don't get to choose emergencies. Emergencies choose you. This president's been waiting on an emergency for 2 years. Congress didn't see the emergency. If Congress thought this was an emergency when we were debating this over the last 45 days, they would have given him the funding for this. He couldn't convince Congress that there was an emergency, so there must not be an emergency. Plus, border crossings are at a 50-year low, so I don't understand what he's worried about. What is the fear that he's trying to generate? I'll tell you where the emergency is, Brian.
Christopher, let me just get a word in. It's really not at a low, because they're at a high. In fact, in January, apprehensions were 58,207, the most over the past 5 years. And CBP announced that agents in the Rio Grande Valley apprehended 1,300 people on Wednesday. Come on.
I'm using the president's own statistics from 2018 from his own government. These are the president's statistics. They are at a 50-year low. And the president even admitted that
I appreciate your passion. But I think you should ask yourself why President Obama wasn't taking more of an urgency, less than you should ask why is President Trump doing it now.
This is not about President Obama. This is about the President of the United States violating the Constitution of the United States.
We're going to see. He's got $8 billion, and all he wants to do is spend it to keep Chris Hahn safe on Long Island. That's all. Chris, thanks so much. We want to keep MS-13 out of your neighborhood because we know it's miles away from my house and your house. Meanwhile, Tucker's back after the break. President Trump's re-election odds, by the way, look kind of dicey for some, but could he be getting a big boost from Democratic radicalism? That story debated next.
Coaching means making tough choices.
And I'm still filling in for Tucker, but Tucker was talking to Mark Stein and Larry Elder just a short time ago, and we taped it. Watch.
Amazingly, the 2020 election cycle is in full swing at this point. Virtually every notable Democrat really in the world has already jumped in. President Trump looked vulnerable a couple of months ago, maybe even doomed to defeat, and that was, of course, the lure that got them into the race. But things have changed a lot in the last 2 months. The Democratic Party's own wokeness has been the real factor. Watch.
An agency like ICE, which repeatedly and systematically violates human rights, does not deserve a dime.
This administration and this president are truly morally corrupt.
When your son looks at you and says, Mama, look, you won, bullies don't win. And I said, baby, they don't, because we're going to go in there, we're going to impeach them.
So what would happen if the least balanced, most extreme members of the Democratic Party took over? Well, the president couldn't have scripted better. He may not have built a wall in the end, but his enemies are so terrifying to normal voters that it's helped him. His approval rating is rising. His reflection odds have improved as well. Author and columnist Mark Stein has been watching all this and joins us tonight. So I'm starting to think that maybe Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and this Ilhan Omar are working for the Trump organization in some capacity. I mean, it almost seems like a setup. It's just almost too perfect.
Yeah, I think they're colluding with Trump, as we should say.
Good point.
And we need to investigate it. Basically, what is going to happen now is that the trajectory in the Democrat side of the field is that they're all going to drive each other even more woke. So you'll think that Elizabeth Warren is woke, and she'll make Kamala Harris even more woke. And in the end, they'll even succeed in woking Joe Biden. And they're all going to be made super hyper woke. Federal officials, policemen in effect, have discussed using the 25th Amendment because they think President Trump is mentally ill. And as Alan Dershowitz said, that's a judgment that should be made by doctors or secretaries or chiefs of staff, anyone, in fact, but a police agency. The question before the electorate is going to be, who is is really the sane or the insane one.
Yeah.
The party that is proposing retrofitting every single 230-year-old colonial-era farmhouse in northern New England in order to make it compatible with the Green New Deal, the party that is committed to abolishing the Border Enforcement Agency, or the guy who's just there in the White House doing his job, even as he drives deep state lunatics to devise ever more absurd ways of trying to get rid of him.
So you've got to wonder if there aren't big parts of the Democratic Party, even the Democratic Party, who are going to look at people like this screaming on CNN all day and think, you know what, this is too much for me. I mean, they could potentially break their party in half.
Yes, I think so, because if you look at what happened last time, they had a problematic and frankly rather unlikable candidate proposing relatively centrist or left of center policies in Democrat terms. This time round, you are going to have candidates who are taking extreme leftist positions. And the risk, of course, is, as with what happened to Ilhan Omar, that in crude identity politics terms, they check all the boxes, they do all the virtue signaling, so they seem kind of nice. And then you read 3 or 4 of their tweets and you realize, actually, this person isn't nice. And I think that's a real danger for the Democrats. Whereas Trump, by comparison, plays a sort of thug and a bully, and he tweets up a storm. But he's actually not unlikable in the same way that some of these Democrats are revealing.
Well, and his policies are basically moderate, which nobody ever says, but it's true.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Yeah. He's relatively centrist on that stuff.
For sure, by the standards of 2 years ago. Anyway, Mark Stein, thank you very much for that. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Tucker.
Well, here's an update to a story we spent a lot of time talking about. The U.S. news media, as you remember, immediately seized the chance to brand a group of high school boys from a Catholic school in Kentucky, Covington, as villains, bigots who are targeting people on the basis of skin color. Well, it soon emerged that not only wasn't true, it was the opposite of what happened. But it didn't matter. Journalists continued to use their power to browbeat and bully the high school kids. Here's one among many examples.
Do you feel from this experience that you owe anybody an apology? Do you see your own fault? We looked at that video and thought about how it felt from the other's perspective. In other words, there were a lot of you, a handful of the others. There's something aggressive about standing there, standing your ground.
Something aggressive about standing there. And journalists weren't the only ones to make that point. The Covington students' own Catholic bishop condemned them as well. Now, that bishop has apologized for what he said. He's admitted that he was bullied into denouncing the boys and that he never even looked at the evidence about what they did. Larry Elder's radio show host from Los Angeles. We're always happy to have him on the show. He joins us tonight. So, Larry, you've got to think, not just in the case of these boys, but in the case of anyone who's been called names by the media collectively and then found to be not guilty of the charges, how does that person get his reputation back?
Well, of course, the person doesn't get the reputation back. The accusation is made above the fold, page 1. The retraction is made deeper into the newspaper. Yeah. What happened here is what I call the intersection of Trump derangement syndrome and what Tom Wolfe, the author who wrote the book Bonfire of the Vanities, calls the media's incessant search for the great white defendant. Nothing better for the media than a white man who's perceived as privileged that they can malign. And that's what happened with Mr. Nick Sandmann. And later on, earlier this week, Tucker, it also happened to a friend of mine named Doug Adler, who used to be an ESPN commentator. 2 years ago, did a match involving Serena Venus Williams, used the term guerrilla tactics, not Gorilla, but guerrilla as in guerrilla tactics. And a New York Times tennis writer named Ben Rothenberg puts out a post and accuses Doug Adler of racism. ESPN demands that he apologize. Adler happens to be white. And he does to keep his job. They still fired him, and for 2 years he's been battling a defamation lawsuit. Finally, he won it, got his job back, but the tennis sports writer at New York Times has not lost his job, nor has he apologized. Nor did anybody in the tennis commentating field come to Doug Adler's rescue. Not the McEnroe brothers, not Martina Navratilova. None of these announcers said guerrilla tactic is a normal term used to describe a tactic in a match. And he got fired, got maligned as a racist, just like Nick Sandmann got maligned as a racist before the facts came in. The intersection of Trump derangement syndrome and the incessant search for the great white defendant.
Well, that's a shocking story. Gorilla spelled G-U-E. The French word, nothing to do with the primate at all. It's a completely different word.
Nothing.
And he gets fired.
And Tucker, when ESPN approached him, he said what you said. He said, I didn't say gorilla as an animal. I said gorilla as in tactic. And they still fired him after he apologized. My goodness. Talk about hysteria. This is mass hysteria. It fit the script. This young man in D.C. was wearing the mega cap. He committed also the sin of being born white. And he was privileged. And so the media just ran with that, just as they ran with the story about Doug Adler. It's outrageous.
And nobody stood up to defend him. They were all cowards. They just looked at their shoes.
One tennis commentator did, named Rami Koenig. He is a South African commentator. Outside of that, nobody did. And Venus Williams could have stopped this in 5 seconds. I know she's busy, but my goodness, she could have stopped it in 5 seconds had she wanted to. Instead, she wouldn't comment. She just let him twist in the wind.
And wreck the man's life and reputation.
Right. And by the way, Tucker, he had a heart attack. His cardiologist said his heart was fine before the stress of being called an international racist for 2 years. And now he's gotten his job back with a settlement, but no apology.
You know, there really aren't many brave people left, which is part of the problem. You are definitely one of them. Larry Elder.
Well, thank you.
It's always a blessing to have you on the show. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Great conversation. Meanwhile, straight ahead, Andrew McCabe now admits the Department of Justice considered bureaucratically overthrowing the Trump administration and tossing the president out. That story's next. They want to amend some of it. We also have breaking news on the Jussie Smollett investigation, plus more of Tucker, who's never been better.
After walking
like a messy and complex growing web of candidates on both sides, really, for 2020. But let's start here. Joe Biden looks like he will get in. My next guest has been speaking with him and says Biden is, quote, incredibly excited to enter the race. He feels he would be the best candidate, and he's ready to go for it. Former economic advisor to President Obama and Fox News contributor Robert Wolf joins me now. You had a very good track record on recognizing the star power of President Obama when he was a candidate.
He was
at
2%. Hillary was 65, but those are such numbers I'll always remember.
So you see that same kind of youthful enthusiasm in Joe Biden this time around?
You know, this is going to be something we've never seen before. We've never had this type of diverse slate. We've never had kind of really a candidate field that probably no one's over 20%. And so we just don't know right now who is that candidate that can get through a primary and then beat President
But it definitely
Trump.
feels like everybody's waiting for him to decide. He's a former vice president. What do you think about what happened last time around? Was he pushed aside for Hillary Clinton, or was it all because of his personal tragedy in his family?
I met with him in September of 2015 when he was deciding. And I know there's been articles about him agonizing this time around. No, he agonized that time around. And I think at that point, you know, his mind was telling him go in, his heart was telling him no, and he couldn't get there. This time around, I think his heart and his mind is ready to go. In my opinion,
but does he have resentment about last time in terms of being nudged aside for Hillary? You know, does he feel like, well, I would have won?
Listen, I've been with him many times where he feels he would have won, and I think, you know, he can second guess himself, but he's now moving forward. And I think the best way for him to move forward is for him to decide to enter.
So the president, you know, says he calls him 1% Joe. He has run twice before. Of course, that was before he was the vice president of the United States for 8 years. The president says, bring it on. He's full of gaffes. He says he's not that smart, not a smart guy.
Well, he may not be a stable genius, but, you know, we only have one in the White House at a time. Listen, we can't predict what's going to happen. There's no question that during the midterm, Joe Biden, the vice president, was the best surrogate for the Democratic Party. And that was a real blue wave. I know that a lot of your viewers don't want to admit that, but we've won over 40 congressional seats. We won seven governorships.
Big pickups in the House.
We won over
no doubt
100
about
state
it.
legislators, and we've gotten 4 out of the 5 blue wall governorships. So he was the #1 surrogate. So I think it bodes well for them. For me, is I haven't decided, you know, if I'm going to support the vice president. There's a lot of great candidates out there, and we have to really take a hard look at who we think is going to be the best to defeat the president.
You know and like Kamala Harris a lot.
Yep.
And you also talk about Beto O'Rourke, who's 46 years old, has that youthful charisma on his side. And you say that, you know, Democrats have succeeded only in electing candidates 53 years old or younger. That youth is what wins on the Democratic side.
Well, to date, since 1960, between JFK and Clinton and Carter and Obama, we like hope and change. We like young. We like aspirational. I do think this time around, because President Trump's in the White House, there is absolutely going to be a debate, is experience important? And I think Vice President Biden's going to say, hey, experience matters. Look what's happening today. We just don't know. I mean,
what's your dream Dem ticket before I let you go?
Well,
you don't have to say president or vice president, but 2 people that you'd like to see run maybe together.
Listen, I don't want to go there yet.
Come on.
A lot of people are saying that, you know, Kamala and Biden would be interesting, or someone like, you know, Kamala and Beto, or, you know, there's going to be a bunch of outsiders coming in. And
no Elizabeth Warren? She done?
I don't think she's done, because we could see where in the first 4 primaries, different people win. And she's certainly been at the forefront on income inequality. My issue is I'm more center-left. I think we need to have a pro-growth Democrat to beat the president, because he's been strong in the economy, and you can't ignore that.
Well, Howard Schultz says he might get out if somebody like Biden goes in.
Howard Schultz should get out before Biden goes in, either way.
Thank you very much. Good to see you. Thanks for being here. Good to have you here. All right, coming up next, this 18-year-old is another young man who pledged to fraternity and never came home from college again. He was reportedly made to drink a gallon of alcohol, and that was just the beginning. He was dead less than an hour later. That is next. Indiana State University have been arrested on charges ranging from misdemeanor hazing to felony second-degree battery. The men allegedly beat pledges with a metal pipe, attempted to burn them with cigarettes, and ordered pledges to lie naked on broken glass. This news comes on the heels of a separate incident at Ohio University, where extreme hazing is being blamed for the death of this 18-year-old freshman who was forced to consume drugs and drink a gallon of alcohol in under an hour. Jonathan Hunt has this story from our West Coast newsroom tonight.
Good evening, Martha. The arrests of 9 members of the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity follow claims that they were involved in hazing that included forcing pledges to lay on broken glass, urinating on them, and forcing them to stand in containers full of ice and water. The charges against the 9 range from criminal hazing to felony battery. 7 of those arrested are still students at LSU. The university issued a statement saying, quote, "This type of behavior is unacceptable and at complete odds with what we expect from our students. It does not belong at LSU. This is a sad day for the university, but one that illustrates the cultural shift occurring at LSU." While the DKE fraternity, now suspended at LSU, said, quote, "In our ongoing educational programming regarding hazing prevention, we emphasize to our undergraduates that individuals should and will be held accountable for their actions. We will continue our efforts to eliminate hazing wherever and whenever it occurs." DKE was founded at Yale in 1844 and says its membership has included 5 U.S. presidents, including both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. Its website boasts that it, quote, "is known for producing outstanding gentlemen, leaders, and jolly good fellows." Louisiana enacted an anti-hazing law after the death of 18-year-old Maxwell Groover at LSU. He died after being forced to down multiple drinks laced with 190 proof alcohol. Forced alcohol use was also allegedly a part of the hazing suffered by Ohio University teenager Colin Wyant, who died last November after also allegedly suffering physical, mental, and verbal abuse and sleep deprivation. According to a toxicology report, the 18-year-old Sigma Pi fraternity member's cause of death was asphyxiation due to nitrous oxide ingestion. And a wrongful death lawsuit filed by his family states that over months of hazing, fraternity members forced drugs, including cocaine, Adderall, and Xanax on him, while also beating him and forcing him to drink a gallon of alcohol in just 1 hour. A lawyer for the family says the fraternity attempted to cover up Wyant's death, and pledges were told to make up a story. In a statement, Ohio University said their hearts go out to Colin's family and friends, and that the Sigma Pi fraternity remains on a cease and desist order pending an investigation. Martha?
Unbelievable. Jonathan Hutt, thank you. Joining me now exclusively, the attorney for Colin Wyant's family, Rex Elliott. Mr. Elliott, thank you very much for being with us tonight. So who is your lawsuit against? Are you planning to also sue the university, the Ohio University?
Well, yeah, we don't know just yet. We don't have enough information regarding what the university knew and what it should have known. But our lawsuit right now is directed at the organizations directly responsible for this, which are the local chapter of the Sigma Pi fraternity and the national chapter of the Sigma Pi fraternity, which has had problems on college campuses across the country.
You know, when you look at the numbers, I think 40 people have died in hazing incidents in just the past 10 years on college campuses, and the deaths go on before that. And when you listen to what is being done to these young men, and I can't help but think about the rightful work that's being done on campuses to prevent sexual assault and Me Too. And everywhere you go on college campuses today, there are posters everywhere with phone numbers to call. Where are the phone numbers to call and the posters and the movement to stop this kind of senseless death of young men?
Exactly. The reality is that these anti-hazing statutes, some of the publicity in the past, the reality is that fraternities are a thing of the past. You put 50, 60, 70, 18 to 22-year-old boys in a house congregating together, and then you don't watch them. You simply send them over there and you tell them to enjoy their own social status. It's a recipe for disaster, and one life lost is too much.
Absolutely. And this young man, according to what I read earlier about this case, he said to his friends as he was heading out from where they were, I'm going to get hazed. He got a call, time to show up at this off-campus house, which is a separate building where they were doing this stuff. Is that right?
He was on call 24/7. Colin Wyant had just gotten home from a great weekend with his family. He had connected with some of his friends, and he got the call around midnight to connect with the active fraternity members. He was on call. He had, in his world, he had no choice, and he immediately told a friend that, here we go again, I'm about to get hazed. Colin Wyant was seen, observed at 2 o'clock in the morning, perfectly sober, not drunk, not intoxicated. And 50 minutes later, as he ventured into that fraternity house down at 45 Mill Street, he was dead.
It's unbelievable. What do they say? What does the fraternity say? And what do these so-called brothers say about why they do this to these young men and why they did this to this young man, potentially, allegedly, causing his death?
Well, it's a great question, and the reality is there's no redeeming value for the kinds of things that they put Colin through. That night, I will tell you that at 2:50 a.m. in the morning, there was a 911 call placed by one of the active members who told the 911 operator that, hey, Colin seems to be a little unresponsive. Looks like he had way too much to drink that night, which is just a bold-faced lie. And then on top of it all, within hours, instead of being concerned about Colin and his family, the fraternity congregated. They pulled themselves all together. They initiated all the pledges that night. It was not supposed to occur for a couple months. They initiated them that night, had a big meeting, talked about what happened that night in order to get their story straight. So the reality is, this fraternity in particular was not really concerned about life and death. They were concerned about their own survival.
Well, keep us posted on this case. We followed Tim Piazza's case very closely here, and we will follow this case closely as well. And our heart goes out to his family. They must be absolutely heartbroken, of course, at the loss of this young man. Devastated. Unbelievable.
Devastated.
Thank you. This should not happen. Rex Elliott, thank you very much.
Thank you, Martha. It's been a privilege.
Coming up next.
I'm not going to box myself in, but should I become it, you know I'll be looking to women first.
Ladies Night takes on Cory Booker's female VP hunt next.
To be noted.
2020 Democratic hopeful Senator Cory Booker just said this about picking a vice president.
I think that you will rarely see a Democratic ticket anymore without gender diversity, race diversity. I think it's something that we should have. So I'm not going to box myself in, but should I become it, I'll be looking to women first.
Okay. Booker also noted that there should already be a woman president and that he worked hard to make that happen. And with that, our Ladies Night panel, Lisa Booth, Jessica Tarlov, and Rochelle Ritchie. Lisa, he says, of course he would pick a woman if that would be the first place he would go.
Well, I view it as pandering. And also imagine if you're that woman that he picks and he's simply just picking you because he wants, gender diversity on the ticket. I don't like this as a woman. I would rather just be viewed and get a job simply because I'm the best fit for the job. And if you really truly want equality, that's just a level playing field. That's why I'm against things like equal pay. I don't want the government coming in and mandating and dictating the terms with my employer. I want to get increased pay because I deserve it. I worked hard. I'm the better fit for the job.
Yeah.
So I don't.
I would love it if he said, "I'm going to pick the best person for the job,"
exactly.
Rochelle. Well,